While most people have been focused on the escalating tariff fight and the nonstop political drama spilling out of Washington, a far more consequential development has been unfolding quietly in the background. A major aerospace agreement has been taking shape that could generate more than 12,000 jobs across Canada, lead to the construction of full-scale manufacturing facilities in Ontario and Quebec, position the country as an international center for advanced fighter jet production, and signal clearly to the United States that Canada intends to make its own strategic decisions moving forward. It wasn't a secret that Saab had previously floated the idea of building aircraft in Canada. That proposal had been circulating for some time. But what's changed recently is the level of precision behind the promise. Earlier statements from Saab officials suggested the potential creation of roughly 10,000 Canadian jobs. That figure made headlines, but there was very little detail attached to it. No clear explanation of how large an aircraft order would be required. No concrete roadmap. It sounded impressive, but it lacked specifics. People heard 10,000 jobs and reasonably asked what that actually meant in practical terms. Now those missing details have been clarified. Saab has officially increased its projected employment impact to 12,600 jobs. That revised number is directly tied to a combined package involving both the Gripen fighter jet and the GlobalEye airborne surveillance aircraft for Canada. The scale has expanded, and the industrial outline has become far more defined. According to the updated proposal, Saab intends to establish production hubs in Ontario and Quebec, Canada's primary industrial centers. But the plan doesn't stop there. It also envisions a nationwide supplier network that would connect businesses from coast to coast into the aerospace supply chain. Raw materials, advanced components, specialized services, all sourced from Canadian companies. Small and medium-sized firms across multiple provinces would have the opportunity to participate in what could become one of the largest defense manufacturing initiatives in Canadian history. The GlobalEye component is particularly significant and often overlooked. In Canada, the initiative falls under the Airborne Early Warning and Control System program. What makes it notable is the partnership structure. The aircraft platform would be based on Bombardier's Global 6500 business jet, produced by the Canadian aerospace manufacturer. Saab would then integrate its sophisticated radar systems, surveillance equipment, and mission technologies onto that Canadian-built airframe. Final assembly and production would take place in Canada. That arrangement goes far beyond a simple purchase. It represents shared development and domestic capability building, combining Canadian manufacturing expertise with Swedish defense technology. Simon Carroll, president of Saab Canada, emphasized that the company stands ready to provide sovereign, cutting-edge solutions tailored to Canada's defense needs while strengthening domestic industry. The term sovereign carries weight. It suggests not just acquiring aircraft, but gaining the capacity to maintain, upgrade, and potentially manufacture critical defense systems independently, without relying entirely on external approval or foreign control. What truly expands the scope of this proposal, however, is Saab's stated intention to use Canadian facilities not only to supply the Royal Canadian Air Force, but also to serve export customers. In other words, Canada would not simply be buying aircraft, it would be producing them for global markets. That shift would transform the country into a manufacturing base for both fighter jets and advanced surveillance aircraft destined for international buyers. Potential customers are already being discussed. Ukraine, for example, has expressed interest in acquiring more than 100 Gripen fighters. That represents a substantial order by any measure. With Ukraine engaged in an ongoing war and seeking modern aircraft to strengthen its air defenses, such a purchase would carry both economic and geopolitical significance. If those aircraft were manufactured in Canadian facilities by Canadian workers, the impact would extend beyond domestic job creation. It would position Canada as a direct contributor to the defense of a democratic nation confronting armed aggression. And it doesn't stop with Ukraine. Other potential buyers for the GlobalEye surveillance aircraft reportedly include France and Germany, the two largest economies in Europe and central pillars of European defense policy. Both countries are reassessing their long-term surveillance capabilities, and if Canada became the production base for these aircraft, that would place Canadian industry at the center of Europe's next generation of airborne early warning systems. Now consider something that happened roughly 6 months ago. At a high-level gathering in Europe, what was traditionally known simply as the EU Summit was formally branded the EU-Canada Summit. That shift wasn't cosmetic. It reflected a deliberate elevation of Canada's role in European strategic discussions. During that meeting, Canada aligned itself with a massive European defense procurement initiative valued at approximately $1.3 trillion, as European governments committed to dramatically increasing military spending in response to evolving security threats. Europe is preparing to purchase enormous quantities of military equipment over the next decade, and as political tensions grow between Washington and several European capitals, more EU countries are signaling reluctance to rely exclusively on American defense suppliers. That shift creates space for alternatives like the Gripen. Picture what that could mean in practical terms. Canada finalizes an agreement with Saab. Manufacturing plants rise in Ontario and Quebec. A coast-to-coast supplier network takes shape. Gripen fighters and globalized surveillance aircraft are assembled on Canadian soil, not just for domestic use, but for export across Europe and other regions. Orders from European governments flow into Canadian factories. Canadian engineers, technicians, and tradespeople build the aircraft. Domestic firms provide aluminum, steel, composites, avionics components, and advanced electronics, including materials that have recently faced American tariffs. Instead of Canadian metals being penalized or discounted in foreign markets, they would be absorbed into a high-value defense manufacturing ecosystem that serves both Canada and allied democracies. That would represent a strategic pivot, turning trade pressure into industrial opportunity. This proposal is far more detailed than earlier discussions. The scale has grown, the job estimates have increased, and the geopolitical alignment is clearer. Saab is aggressively pursuing the contract, but this is no longer just a corporate sales pitch. It reflects deeper coordination between European governments and Canada. It signals a potential restructuring of defense industrial partnerships. Given all that, it would be surprising if Ottawa abruptly abandoned the concept and defaulted entirely to the F-35. Still, there are scenarios where that could occur. One possibility is that Canada yields to pressure from the United States, and that pressure is real. Another would be an extraordinary offer from Washington that fundamentally reshapes broader economic relations. That would likely require eliminating tariffs, stabilizing the USMCA framework on highly favorable terms, and delivering binding guarantees of long-term trade certainty. But the question is credibility. Recent history complicates any assumption that such guarantees would endure. The United States withdrew from NAFTA and renegotiated it into USMCA. It exited the Paris Climate Accord, stepped away from the Iran nuclear agreement, and abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Even USMCA, intended to restore predictability, has faced rhetorical attacks from within Washington itself. When trade agreements are repeatedly revised or discarded, it raises legitimate concerns about durability. Building national defense policy and long-term industrial strategy requires stability. It requires confidence that agreements will hold beyond a single political cycle. That is the strategic calculation Canadian policymakers must weigh. At the same time, there are genuine risks to consider. Some defense analysts caution that selecting the Gripen over the F-35 could create friction within North America's joint defense architecture. Justin Massey, chair of the Political Science Department at the Université du Québec à Montréal, has highlighted one specific issue: integration with NORAD. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, has formed the backbone of continental air defense cooperation between Canada and the United States for decades. The concern raised is whether Swedish-built Gripen fighters would integrate seamlessly with systems currently optimized around American platforms like the F-35. Interoperability, secure communications, and data-sharing compatibility are critical in a joint defense structure. If aircraft and software systems are misaligned, operational coordination could be affected. These are serious considerations. They do not automatically invalidate the Gripen proposal, but they underscore the complexity of the decision. The debate is not simply about buying jets. It is about long-term sovereignty, industrial capacity, alliance management, and strategic trust, all unfolding at a moment when global defense relationships are shifting in real time. That's a legitimate concern, and it deserves to be treated seriously. Massey also made another point that's worth quoting accurately. He argued that if Canada ends up with only 16 F-35s, the number already committed to, then from a purely military standpoint, it makes little sense. His view is that such a small fleet would function more as a symbolic presence than as a meaningful operational contribution to NORAD. In other words, if Canada intends to stay fully aligned within that structure, then it would need a complete F-35 fleet, not just a limited batch. Here's where I respectfully disagree. From a strategic perspective, what seems far more questionable is tying Canada's core defense capabilities to a weapons system entirely governed by the same country that is currently exerting the most economic and political pressure on Canada. That isn't rhetorical exaggeration. It's based on visible actions: punitive tariffs, repeated trade threats, dismissive comments about binding agreements, even talk that brushes up against Canadian sovereignty. When you assess which nation is actively using leverage against Canada's economy right now, it's not Moscow or Beijing, it's Washington. And yet the proposal on the table would have Canada deepen its reliance on US-controlled infrastructure for software updates, mission systems, maintenance frameworks, data links, and operational integration. The F-35 program is deeply centralized. Critical elements of its functionality are managed through American-controlled systems. So the question becomes whether it is strategically wise to anchor national defense to a platform that depends on the continued goodwill of a government that has demonstrated unpredictability. At the same time, European partners are signaling something very different. The European Union has been expanding defense collaboration and increasing military budgets. European governments are seeking diversified suppliers and cooperative industrial relationships rather than hierarchical ones. That context matters. On the NORAD issue specifically, the interoperability concern sounds technical, but it is largely political. The Gripen was designed for NATO environments. It operates with NATO standard communication systems and has integrated alongside various allied aircraft. The suggestion that it could not function within continental defense systems assumes that the United States would refuse to facilitate that integration. If that is the risk being highlighted, then it reinforces the broader question: should Canada structure its defense policy around the possibility of deliberate obstruction from its closest partner? If integration becomes conditional on purchasing a specific American product, that's not purely about military compatibility, that's leverage. And building long-term defense strategy around leverage controlled by another state introduces vulnerability. Industry Minister Melanie Joly has also weighed in with comments that indicate how the government may be framing the decision. She has emphasized that Ottawa is evaluating major projects based on their ability to enhance security, protect sovereignty, and generate domestic employment. That framing is deliberate. It links defense procurement directly to economic development and national autonomy. In a recent interview, she stated that while Canada cannot dictate the behavior of the U.S. president, it can determine where it directs its own defense spending and which companies receive contracts. That remark underscores a central theme. The government may view procurement decisions not just as military choices, but as instruments of economic policy and sovereignty reinforcement. When you combine the expanded 12,600 job projection, proposed manufacturing facilities in Ontario and Quebec, the national supplier network, the Bombardier collaboration on Global Eye, the possibility of exports to Ukraine and European customers, the broader EU-Canada defense alignment, and the political emphasis on sovereign investment, it certainly appears that momentum is shifting toward a potential Saab agreement. That said, defense procurement decisions are rarely straightforward. Companies compete aggressively. Governments posture publicly while negotiating privately. There are strategic calculations happening behind closed doors that aren't visible. Trade tensions with the United States are a major factor in that equation. The president has recently downplayed the significance of CUSMA, the successor to NAFTA, describing it as unimportant. That rhetoric injects further instability into North American trade relations. At the same time, a pending U.S. Supreme Court decision on the legality of certain tariffs could reshape the economic landscape. If the court rules that the tariffs are unlawful, that could impose constraints on further escalation. If it rules the tariffs are valid, it could embolden additional measures, especially if the administration views existing trade agreements as flexible or expendable. The legal outcome is uncertain. The court is divided, and the constitutional questions surrounding executive trade authority are complex. The decision could either stabilize the situation or intensify it. Given that level of uncertainty, it would be surprising to see Ottawa move immediately. Even if there is growing interest in the Saab proposal, the broader geopolitical and trade context makes an immediate contract award unlikely. Decisions of this magnitude tend to wait until the surrounding environment becomes clearer. I believe this fighter jet decision has become one of the strongest bargaining chips Canada holds right now, and that's exactly why the government is unlikely to play it too soon. What happens over the next several months on tariffs, trade talks, and the pending Supreme Court ruling in the United States could determine how valuable that card becomes. As long as the F-35 agreement remains technically alive, Washington has a reason to tread carefully. We're talking about billions of dollars in defense contracts, significant American employment tied to production, and the symbolic importance of keeping Canada inside the F-35 partnership. If Ottawa walks away and selects the Gripen instead, all of that disappears overnight. That's leverage, and policymakers are fully aware of it. Now, I want to be transparent. I'm describing what I think is happening strategically, not what I personally prefer. If it were up to me, Canada would make a clear, independent decision based strictly on long-term sovereignty and economic resilience. The signals all point toward reducing over-reliance on the United States, strengthening ties with like-minded partners in Europe, and asserting control over our own industrial and defense trajectory. My instinct is to move decisively rather than prolong uncertainty, but I suspect the government will delay. The U.S. midterm elections are approaching in November, and those results could significantly alter the political landscape. Will voters curb presidential authority by shifting control of Congress? Will divided government temper aggressive trade policies? Or could the opposite occur, with electoral outcomes reinforcing and expanding executive power? There's also the unpredictable factor of how the president might react to either victory or defeat. Escalation is possible. So is recalibration. No one can say with confidence. Given that uncertainty, Ottawa may simply wait and observe. Meanwhile, Saab continues refining its proposal, adding specificity and strengthening the economic case. The offer is arguably more attractive than it has ever been, yet committing immediately would eliminate a powerful negotiating tool just as trade tensions and CUSMA renegotiation loom. From a purely tactical standpoint, holding the decision in reserve maximizes flexibility. Public opinion is also shaping the environment. Recent polling suggests that 43% of Canadians favor replacing the CF-18s entirely with Gripen fighters. That makes it the single most popular option. About 29% support a blended fleet, keeping the initial F-35 commitment while supplementing with Gripens. Only 13% back sticking exclusively with F-35s under the current plan, making it the least supported scenario. The regional breakdown is revealing. In Quebec and British Columbia, sole reliance on the F-35 polls at just 9%. Even in Alberta, widely regarded as the country's most conservative province and often the most receptive to close U.S. alignment, support for an all F-35 fleet reaches only 18%. That means more than 80% of Albertans prefer either the Gripen or a mixed approach. This is not a narrow ideological issue. The sentiment cuts across provinces and political identities. A clear majority of Canadians appear open to diversifying away from complete dependence on American military platforms. From that perspective, the Gripen proposal checks multiple boxes: tens of thousands of jobs, new production facilities in key provinces, integration of a nationwide supplier network, collaboration with Bombardier on advanced surveillance aircraft, potential exports to European allies, alignment with the EU's expanding defense investment strategy, and greater operational autonomy. Beyond the economics and geopolitics, there's also the symbolic dimension, demonstrating that Canada makes strategic choices based on its own assessment of national interest. Still, timing matters. The Supreme Court ruling in the United States could reshape trade dynamics. CUSMA renegotiations could introduce new pressures. The midterms could redefine the political calculus in Washington. All of those variables may encourage delay. In the end, the question is not simply which aircraft is superior. It's about leverage, sovereignty, economic strategy, alliance management, and long-term independence. I suspect the government will wait, monitor events, and preserve its negotiating power as long as possible. But I'm curious where you stand. Should Canada cancel the F-35 contract and move forward with Saab? Maintain the current F-35 plan? Or adopt a mixed fleet? The debate is clearly larger than a single procurement choice. It's about the direction of Canadian defense and industrial policy for decades to come.